Shavua Tov Rabosai, and we are moving on to discuss Korban Pesach. And this you'll find on page Chaf, on the left column, about 4 paragraphs down from the top of the Omer. We have a new halacha with regard to Korban Pesach of mechitza. Until now, we've seen that the mechitza of a korban, if it's kodshim, that mechitza goes as far as the azor is concerned. If it's kodshim kalim, then we extend the mechitza to all of Yerushalayim. What is the mechitza with regard to Korban Pesach? And here we have halacha of bayis. The Torah says that we should eat the Korban Pesach in the bayis. And the halacha is that once you start eating the Korban Pesach in the bayis, you are part of a chabura. That group of people represents minuyim. Each one of them was manui on the Korban Pesach. They made a kinyan on the Korban Pesach on behalf of a group of people. And they're all, so to speak, signed on to the Korban Pesach. Then they decide one particular bias. And halacha is ein yotzim michabura lechabura. We're not allowed to take the Korban Pesach and the meat of the Korban Pesach from one chabura to the other. And we can't take it out of the bias. Now, we've been speaking about the psul of yotze. The psul of yotze means, in the case of kodshim, outside of the azora. We spoke about the psul of yotze in kodshim kalim when it goes outside of the walls of Yerushalayim. Now we're talking about a psul yotze when it goes out of the walls of the house. Because once they were koveya that the entire chabura would eat the Korban Pesach within a bias, then the psul of yotze is chal once the basar is taken outside the bias. Now we move on to something called parim hanisrafim. Now parim hanisrafim, eventually, the basar is taken out of the mikdash and it's burnt somewhere outside the mikdash. But that's going to be later on, after the avodos are complete. Now we're talking early in the stage where it's before Zrika. So before Zrika's Hadam, what's the psul of Yotze with regard to Chatos Primios? And the simple answer should be that since a Chatos has the status of Kodshe Kodshim, just like in all Chatos, the halacha is that chutz mechitza means if it's taken out of the azora, the same standard will apply with regard to chatos primios, because even though it's going to be nisrafim, but nevertheless right now it's got the status of a chatos, it's kodshim, and therefore the psul yotze should be chal the moment it steps out of the azora. Who's suffik the Gemara? He tells you in the footnote where to look up this Gemara. It is just 1 second. Well, what number we're looking at? Shin Sadi Beis. He tells you Hey Tes Amid Beis Sadi Amid Aleph. Just 1 second. So where are we? No. My mistake. Shin Sadi Gimel. Gemara Kuf Dalid Amid Beis. Sorry. Kuf Dalid Amid Beis. So the Gemara in Zvachim on Daf Kuf Dalid Amid Beis vacillates back and forth as to when the psul of Yotze is chal in a chatas primis. Is it like any kodshim, which means that the psul of Yotze applies to the azara? And once the basar leaves the walls of the azara, like any kodshim, it becomes pasul midin Yotze. Or shall we say no? This chatos is different than any chatos, because in any case of Chatas, the Mizbeach gets Haktorah. And the Mizbeach, of course, in the Azara. But in the case of Chatas Primius, when it's Nisrafim, then the Basar Achatas is not burnt on the Mizbeach, and therefore the Mechitza of the Azara is no longer applicable. And the Gemara vacillates back and forth on this question and comes to no definite conclusion. Now, at this point, he quotes a suffix in the Migdash David. It's a little bit erased in my copy. Maybe you have it in your copy. It's Shin Sadi Dal, but I believe it says Migdash David. What is bothering the mind of the Migdash David? Yatsu hadam v'himorim lelishkos habnuyas bechol upsuchos lekodesh. There were a number of chambers in the Migdash that were built outside the Azara, but they opened up into the Azara. So the actual lishka was bechol, but the airspace through which you entered into the lishka was bekodesh. And now we said the following. With regard to Kodshim, and there's a mitzvah incumbent upon the Kohen to eat the basar of Kodshim, but he's got to eat it inside the Azara. So the halacha is that we have a ribui to include even l'shakos hapsuchos l'kodesh, even though b'nuyos b'chol, they are built outside the Azara, but you enter into the lishaka through the Azara, and now there's going to be a psul of Yotze. No, there's no psul of Yotze. Why? Because we have a special ribui, and the Torah allows the Kohen to take the basar of chatos, or asham, which is kodshim, and bring it into this lishka, even though he's bringing it b'chol. The physical location of the chatos is outside the Azara. And therefore you would say it's possibly bin Yotze. But since the entranceway is through the Azara, there's a special ribui that permits the Kohen to take the basar into this lishka, into this chamber, which is B'nuya B'chol. Now, of course, as far as the avoda of the zrikas adam, etc., there's no ribui. And as we've discussed on many occasions, akrovas hakarbon splits into two parts. One dimension is the avodas hakarbon, which begins with zrika, which begins with shchita and ends with zrika, and then we have the second part, which is achilas habasa, which divides up into two subcategories. The ribui, in a case of kodshim, regarding a lishka that's b'nuya b'chol, but psucha lekodesh, is only as far as achila is concerned. Einam ksherim lasos be'em avodas hadam v'ha'imurim. Imagine if he would want to do a zrika. Let's say he was standing at the entranceway to this lishka, and he did a zrika, and the dam would reach the mizbeach. So he's physically outside the Azara. The dam reaches the mizbeach in the Azara. Awesome. No good. Because the ribui that this lishka has the status of Azara is not as far as the avodas hakohen in Akrava is concerned, that he can stand in the lishka and it's considered as if he's standing in the Azara. No. It's a separate ribui, and it only establishes that the achilas habasa could take place in this lishka. Ach einam ksherim lasos beheves avoda shel dam. And therefore, we don't know if the basa should be pasul biyotze. On the one hand, we had a special ribui that the Kohen is allowed to eat the basar in this lishka. Why? Because it's b'nuya b'chol b'psuchos b'kodesh. And the Torah was Ribsa Torah Lemachila of Kodshim. It's as if he's eating it in the Azara. On the other hand, one could argue that there's a psul yotze because the avodas hakarban cannot be done inside the lishka. The lishka does not have a full-fledged. It's not a full-fledged azara. You can see the azaras extending, but only relative to certain dinim. The Torah gave license to extend the azara into this lishka for purposes of permitting the kohen to eat the bust, but it's not azara. And therefore, if the Kohen is standing in this lishka, he's not standing in the Azara. And even if he would do the avoda from that point, long distance, it would be possible. And this is what the Migdash David vacillates back and forth on this question. Finally, Mei Kiyar, which again is the water that's used for Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, Nechluku Rishonim im Nifsalim B'Yitzia Michutz La'Azara. The avoda of the karbanos requires azara, but Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim is not an avoda. And even though the kiyar was located in the azara, and that's where the Kohen would implement the Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim, but nevertheless, since the Kiddush itself is not an avoda, therefore, the halacha of psul yotze would not apply. And in the footnote, he says that this is really, in fact, a machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos. Rashi is the one who indicates that there's a psul yotze if the mei kiyar is taken out of the azara, but Tosfos says that einam nifsalim. And apparently the Rambam might be holding the same way as Tosfos. Because again, since the mei kiyar are not designated for an avoda, so the significance of the azara is more technical, but not essential. It's technical because the Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim is implemented in the Azara. But as far as the Hefts of the Mayim, the Mei Kiyar, that's something totally different. It's not an Avoda. It has no relationship to the Migdash in any direct way. And indirectly, it's related to the Migdash and to the Mizbeach because only a Kohen who does the Kiddush Yadayim Raglayim could be Oved on the Mizbeach. But there's no direct relationship between the Mayim and the Kiyar and the Mizbeach. And therefore, Azara becomes second. And now, Rabosa, we move on to another topic within these dimensions of Psulei Karbanos that we've been discussing. We discussed the Psul Yotze, and before that we had a Psul Lina, and now we're going to talk about a psul of Tumah. Nitmu haimurim o adam. This is going to divide up into two subcategories. There's Tumah of the emurim and there's Tumah of the dam. And one thing is common to both of them. There is a disqualification called Tumah. However, there'll be nuances of differences as we go along between the emurim and the dam. Now, there is one opinion regarding dam kodshim in the Gemara in Pesachim on Daf Tes Zayin. In fact, the Rambam is of the opinion, like that, l'halacha, like that view, that dam is not subject to tumah because it's kodshim. The elevated status of the dam as dam kodshim makes the dam impervious to tumah. And that is one daya in the Gemara of Pesachim Tes Zayin, and that seems to be the accepted daya according to the Rambam in the first chapter of Psulei HaMukdash. So, Blineder, as we go along, we hope to get a grasp on this issue and how is it possible that there's no tumah in dam kodshim? Why would that be? We'll begin our discussion with a pasuk at the very end of Sefer Shmos. And this is the source for what's called Tzitz Meratza al Hatum. The pasuk says, "Vaya al metzach Aaron." He will wear the tzitz on his forehead. Aaron, of course, is paradigmic of all Kohanim, and specifically the Kohen Gadol. V'nasa Aaron es havona kadosh. Somehow the tzitz upgrades the status of the Kohen Gadol, in this case Aaron, and his status now changes through the tzitz, such that he can create a ritzui on tumah. Tzitz meratze al tumas ha'olim. And that means that we're going to be maktir something on the mizbech that's tamei, and that's fine. That's acceptable. I'm not sure if it's l'chatchila, the right thing to do. Is it hutra? Is it dechuya? We'll have to get into that. But the Torah is saying that the tzitz is maratza, the ritzui karmon will come through the tzitz magically. Again, whether the Kohen has to wear it on his forehead or if it let's say he takes it off and he puts it on the table, is there still a power in the tzitz itself, or it's only that the tzitz empowers the Kohen Gadol to be meratza al atuma? All that is issues. Is af shenifsalu ha'imur v'adam. So now we're holding that the imur and dam were recipients of tumah; they contracted tumah. Mikol makom yachol lechatchila lahaktir emurim tmeim o lizrok dam tameh. Who could believe such a thing? To put something on the mizbech that's tameh, to eat Kodshim tmeim, to allow for zrikas the dam when the dam is contracted tumah, put that dam on the mizbeach? How could that be? And the answer is tumas sitz marat. Tumah is sitz marat. Okay, but medvar amurim, this is all on a d'oraisa level. Now the Rabbanan with their gzeros jump into the rink. The gazru lechatchila lo lizrok es adama tomei v'lo lahatir es ha'imur matmeim. The Rabbanan don't want it. They don't want to let you do this rik on dam shenitma. They don't want you to let the emurim shenitmu be burnt on the mizbeach. Why did the Rabbanan make such a gzera? And this leads us to the conclusion that sitz meratza al hatuma is only dechuya. Post facto, if he was zorik the dam tameh or was maktiv the emur tmeim, the tzitz magically will be maratza. But lechatchila, when the dam contracts tumah, the emur, they're not allowed to put that on the mizbeach. The Rabbanan went a step further, and they completely suspended the halach of tzitz maratza. Practically speaking, there won't be any tzitz maratza based on this gzeras chachamim that lo yizrak dam tameh v'lo yaktir es ha'imur shenitmu. We don't do it. You don't take dam tameh and be zorik it on the mizbeach. Don, I don't hear you or see you, but I'm relying on the fact that you're there. No response.
Yes,
Don,
we are here.
If you do hear me, because again,
I'm here. I'm here.
oh, okay, if you do hear me, I am unofficially appointing you. Because the Mikdash, I don't know, maybe it'll be built today. You're going to be in charge, Don, and you're going to tell them not to be zorek the dam that contracted tumor. Because, Kohenim's reasoning. We need a Kohen who's a little bit more calm about it. The Kohenim get very involved. And they run and they want to, they have dam and they know that this it sits on the fire of the Kohen Gadol. We've got to be zorek the dam. You have to tell them, no. We will not allow you to be zorek the dam. So what happens, Don, if the Kohen didn't listen to you? Ovru v'zarku esadam. They went ahead and they were zorek the dam. What's the status of the korban? Is there ritzui tzitz? Did the Rabbanah go a step further and completely suspend and nullify the power of the tzitz to be meratzeh? No, a korban kosher. Bailim nisratzu. There was ritzui bailim. No replacement korban is going to be required. Mishum ritzui tzitz. The Kohanim got too involved. We asked them to slow down. Don was there to supervise, but they didn't listen to him. Why didn't they listen to him? I'll tell you why they didn't listen to him. Because they were so involved and so fatalt, we say here, so excited about being zorek the dam. I'm a member of the mishmeres of the Kohanim. I get my opportunity like once or twice a year. And now there's a korban at stake. And I've got the dam. The dam contracted tumor. Don is telling me, wait a minute. And out of a sense of excitement, the Kohen lost it and he went ahead and he was zorek the dam. Here's where the Kohen Gadol is going to come to the fore with his tzitz, and he's going to be meratzeh on this korban. He's going to amazingly achieve this goal because the Torah invested in the Kohen Gadol that power, that authority to use the tzitz to be meratzeh ala tumah. And that's going to be the din p'di'ev. But then you have a different scenario. A Kohen who's amazing. He's deliberate. He's rebellious. Chas v'shalom, we should have such a Kohen, but we know from all of the Gemaras that Kohanim, over different periods of time, they weren't always ay. Bizarek es adam b'tumah b'mezid is we're not going to eat the bus of the korban. That was in the case of Mason. Does that mean that therefore we should penalize the Balat korban and establish that they have to bring a replacement korban? Gemara says no. The ofen shezorak hakohen es adam b'mezid gazru chacham shlo lechol es abosar. Let's say it was a korban shlomim, and the bailim are waiting online to get, some beautiful roasted piece of steak from their korban, spiked korban. No. Go sue the Kohen. Take him to a din Torah because he deliberately was zorek the dam b'tumah. And the Rabbanan said we're going to disqualify and exclude any possible achila of the bus. What about the bailing? He just spent $500, Canadian dollars, maybe even American dollars. And he brought the korban, and the Kohen messed up. and deliberately was zorik the dam betumah, and we have a phrase in Yiddish, was bin ich schuldig? Am I guilty that now I have to replace the carbon because the Kohen didn't do what he was supposed to do? And he was zorik es adam b'mezid. That far we can't go. We cannot undermine the kashrus of the carbon based on the principle of tzitz meratza. The carbon is kosher. The ritzui was established by the virtue of the Kohen. And now you're going to tell me, well, we want to penalize someone and disqualify the carbon. The Torah recognizes the carbon is valid. You know what? Censure the Kohen, but don't undermine the halach of ritzui carbon through the power of the tzitz. Don't require the bailim to replace this carbon with the second carbon. But if they're waiting online for achilas habasar, then we're going to institute this gezerah, and because we want to avoid any sort of avoda with dam betumah, we're going to tell you that there's no achilas habasar. Now, how far are we going to go with ritzui tzitz? Let's say in the case of shogeg, there's no knas over here. We're not imposing any sort of penalties, and therefore we are going to recognize and validate the korban. And not only that, we'll allow for the achilas habasar insofar as the Kohen was the shogeg. What happens now if the basar itself contracts to him? Then for sure we can't eat the basar. The ritzui of the tzitz is on the dam, is on the murim perhaps, but not on the basar necha. Is therefore nitma basar ein rasham li'ochel. Now, how far are you going to go with that? What happens in the case of a korban tzibur? Are we going to assume that nitma basar is halachas ein rasham li'ochel even in the case of a korban tzibur? The answer is one and the same. That is, what difference does it make whether it's a korban yachid or korban tzibur? The tzitz is only maratza on the dam. It's not maratza on the basar, because the Torah prohibited eating basar kodshim shenitmu. Period. You want to talk about the avodas hakarban? Was it kosher? Was there ritzui? The Bible have to bring another one. Here we introduce the power of the tzitz. But now you want to talk about the basar itself became tameh. Talking about a lavdo rice. The after korban tzibur she'ein hatzibur matir iser achilas basar kodshim b'tumah. That's a separate lav. You get 49 lashes for that. We're not going to allow the recognize the ability of the tzitz to be maratz on something that's a lavdo rice. However, there is something called tumah hutra b'tzibur. For example, what happens if most of the tzibur contracted tumah and it's a korban pesach? Are we going to do away with the korban pesach? This year, no korban pesach. Why? Because most of the tzibur contracted the disease. Herd immunity. So halacha is that a korban pesach is brought bitum if rov hatzibur tmei, and we will not push off the tzibur to pesach shein. But then the question is, who's going to eat the basar? Because the very moment that a member of this community who's tameh, and most of the people in this community are tameh, he eats the basar becomes tameh. And if the basar becomes tameh, because let's say, for example, in Avatumas Matame Ochlin Umashkin, then we say that the tzitz cannot be maratza on achilas basar v'tumah. But you know what? If that principle applies to a Korban Pesach, then fold up shop. There ain't no Korban Pesach b'tzibur. Why? Because Korban Pesach is unique within the entire constellation of Korbanos. And what sets it aside? If there's no achilas habasar, then there's no Korban Pesach. Achilas habasar in general in Kodshim is, again, it's very important. I'm not denying it, but it's secondary. It's not primary. It's not critical. If the basar gets lost and it's tameh, the korban is still kosher. Not so in the case of Korban Pesach. The entire thrust and purpose and goal, the agenda of the Korban Pesach is to eat the Korban Pesach and be achlu es habasar b'layla zeh. So what does it mean that the Pesach is ba b'tumah? That if Rov Atzibur contracted tumah, we will bring the Korban Pesach. Who's going to eat the Korban Pesach? Yecholim li'ochla afsha basar nitma. Mishum she'ikar hakorban. We're now looking on page Chafal. Ba kidei l'kaybo mitzvah achila. I would never say that about any other korban, that the purpose of the korban is to be matir achila, to fulfill the mitzvah achila. Mitzvah achila b'mkoma kvoda b'mkoma murach. It's a great mitzvah, but it doesn't represent the resign the etre of the korban. But in Korban Pesach, the whole purpose of the Korban Pesach is an excuse, so to speak. It's just a backdrop for the mitzvah of yachal es habasar, eating the basar. So it's pointless to bring the korban b'tumah if you're not going to allow the achila. If you're not going to allow the achila, the korban can't be brought at all. And we know that the korban is brought if rov hatzibur tmeim. V'chein yecholim la'achlo hatmeim mikol hatumas chutz min hatmeim mituma zid. And this is a Mishnah in Psachim Adaf Ayin Vav Beis that establishes that you can eat the Korban Pesach if Rov Atzibur Tmeim, and it doesn't matter what tumah they've contracted. But there's an exceptional rule with regard to Zibur. That's a very complicated sugya of Masechet Psachim. I remember we tried to learn it, but only superficially. It's very, very challenging. Okay, so we're going to go on in Mitzvah Shem tomorrow with our discussion about a korban tzibur b'tumah. We touched on it with regard to Korban Pesach, and we want to look at other korban.